Thank you very much for joining us. Thanks for joining Genius Boards, and thank you to my panel, who I will introduce in a moment. Thank you very much for giving up your time for Genius Boards and sharing, most importantly, your intelligence, your knowledge, your experiences, and that will make it an extremely interesting session for all of us. So thank you very much for being with us. This will be interesting. Just hold on a second. Have you got your headset? Perfect. Sorry, my apologies. Risk management is one of those really interesting dilemmas that we deal with. As a board evaluator, I will come across risk committees, I will come across audit and risk committees, and I will come across audit committees and no risk committee. One of the interesting conversations I had with the FTSE 250 chairman was, why didn't they have a risk committee given the nature of their business, which I would have put into an extremely high risk category business? And he said, no, it's a board responsibility. So they never went into anything in detail. They never addressed risk very specifically. They were all responsible for it, and they did nothing specific about it. So my concern is a misunderstanding that occurs at board level, thinking that a risk committee, a committee absolves the rest of the board from any responsibility, which any of us who know, thank you for smiling, Susie, who are involved in governance, knows fully that that is the deep dive space, the place that does get closer to the business and then allows the board to challenge the risk committee at a much more deeper fundamental level. So those are the kind of things I want us to tease out in our conversation later. But making sure that we do understand what risk is about, and it's not about a risk matrix that is inert, flat, and boring, and has a whole bunch of operational risks on it, and that's it. We do tend to find in businesses that I work with that the operational side of risk management is reasonably well done, that it is managed through the business, by the individuals who are then handling that risk management element that they need to handle. So we do tend to see that that element of operational risk, health and safety risk, all your normal governance risks, those kind of things are typically picked up by leaders in the organization for which they're responsible. The area I find that is where risk management is not well done is typically around the higher level risks, the ones we don't always talk about, the one that's involved the people, the board itself, the CEO, the finance director, all those people related risks that we very don't see on the risk matrix, but my goodness, do actually form a huge part of the risk of a business. And we have often seen that, and I know one particular organization where the regulator was very uncomfortable with an individual in the organization, and the board did not see this as worthy of being a risk and worthy of further discussion. You can understand how the regulator got quite concerned about it, and the board still didn't do anything about it, and then wondered why they had a section 166. So we do need to consider the people risks as well, and we will tease that out because they're the ones who actually create the culture, and that is what Horst is going to speak to quite specifically. If we measure risk happens, risk management happens. What worries me at board level is that they will be concerned about the mitigation and accountability, but don't do the blue skies of thinking, do we have the right risks on the register? Do we have the right risks in our top 10 risks? Are we doing the right things? And one of the things I often mentor boards to consider is their own little risk matrix. Not a big one, small one, but the types of things that keep them awake at night that are not the things you likely see on a typical business risk register. The other thing that I do some lecturing in risk management as well. And one of the things that tends to surprise a lot of non-executive directors is that risk is equally an opportunity as it is a negative perceived thing that can hurt us, which is how risk seems to get translated. So it is important that if we don't look to the full opportunities in a business, we don't test what we can do, what the art of the possible is, we actually then get to the stage where the risk actually is that we are not addressing the risk properly. and boards can create risk. Through committees, we know that organizations will become more and more risk averse the more people that are involved in a decision or in a committee or in a gathering. And we can actually, as a board, really harm a business. We can be one of the biggest risks to an organization. We cut off CEOs' wings regularly and then wonder why they leave. We've created that risk by being too risk averse and not allowing a business to fly, to take some risks. What we need is a risk mitigation and a trend analysis that if things start going wrong, you can have a handbrake process, risk tolerance and all those kind of things that we need to look at. But it is important that we actually have to take some risks. We get up every morning, it's a risk. If we don't get up in the morning, it's a risk. So it's managing those risks in an appropriate manner. I think that's probably just my mutterings, just the kind of things that concern me in risk management. And having come from the financial services sector, that sector typically does do risk reasonably well. They do address it. They do have risk committees. Hopefully they've got risk committees that are led by appropriate risk trained people. Where I see the problem is when you get to the FTSE 250 and large corporates, where they see risk as being a financial services problem, not their own business problem. And if that's one thing I am on my bandwagon about regularly, is that all businesses, even those of SMEs, there are risks and there are things that can happen that you need to be able to be planned for and be able to mitigate and to manage. So I do concern myself that a lot of companies are not as risk aware as they should be, haven't identified their risk appetite, for example. But I know Horst is far more proficient in the area of risk management. Horst has got his own business, a risk culture builder, and he does assessments and works with big international corporates, particularly in the financial services sector, helping them address the risk culture through the different layers of the organization, through the different verticals of the organization, such that he is in a position, because we work with Horst in this one, are able to identify to the executives where the risk culture is not performing within the business. Is it on a vertical? Is it on a horizontal? And what is the overall? And gives then Horst the ability to do the training to get the risk culture to where it needs to be. So he is very, very proficient in that space and understands culture better than any of us probably will even begin to understand. Susie, I've known for a long time as well. Susie Hayward has been in the risk game for a long time. She comes from a governance background and has worked in financial services and particularly insurance financial, and has led many risk teams and many risk committees. So we are hearing from two different people from a consultant perspective, and we're speaking to somebody who's on the ground getting the day job done. So thank you very much for both of you for joining me today. But I'm going to turn to you, Horst, first. If you could share with us some of your thoughts. We'll then go into conversation with Susie, and then we'll open the floor to questions. If you could please put your questions into the Q&A function, that would be fantastic, because I can pick them up there and add them into the conversations and add them into the final Q&A session that we'll have with both of the panelists at that point. We'll be together for the remaining part of this hour. So thank you very much. Horst, can I hand over to you?
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you for that introduction. I'm really looking forward.
As much as you can, please come closer to the mic. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I'm really looking forward to this session, and I'm working on one screen today because my other screen just stopped working this morning. So bear with me if there might be a technical thing around the presentation, but I'll be sharing it in PDF. So please bear with me if there's some issues. But good morning, everyone, and it's great being with you, and I'm looking forward to our time talking about risk culture and why it is important for the board to be in charge of that. So just let me know if you can see the shared screen, and we can take it from there. Sharon, can you see the presentation I'm sharing?
Yes, but you need to reduce your size so that we get it into a single screen, please. That 40%, reduce that 40% to 35.
Okay, let me do that quickly. 35. Are you good
You're
for that?
You're perfect. You're spot on.
Great. Good. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for joining us. The way we look at risk culture has evolved a lot since back in 2012 when I was part of what the IRM put together as risk culture guidance at that point in time. So recently, we also added another global survey with the ACCA, and I can later share the results of that and the links to the reports of that. But very often we find two things when we look at a board of directors. Firstly, as the first little picture at the bottom, have you completed your last minute risk assessment? And the second one is your risk report look like the one on the right-hand side of the screen at the bottom. It's all just red, amber, green colors, and nobody knows where they're going and what these colors actually mean. And I've sat in many board meetings and risk committee meetings where they will sit for hours and discuss whether something should have been red, amber, or green as at the end of the previous quarter. And that to us is just not good for the management of risk. It doesn't really contribute to the actual management of risk. So how do we look at risk culture, and how do we look at building an effective risk culture in your organization? The key thing is many organizations are still playing risk avoidance. They want to see everything in that risk report to be green. Those who don't understand the risks or miscalculate them, they will just be exploited by those who are getting better. Research shows us that this 137 institutional investor, the survey came out with the results that more than 80% of them strongly agree that they will pay more. They will pay more for the shares of that organization, even if there's just a perception that the organization is successful at the management of risk. When we did risk culture and the results of these risk culture maturity assessments, one of the things we use them for is to negotiate insurance. How can you show that you are better and a lower risk? You're better at the management of risk and you are a lower risk for the insurer than your peers. You have a risk culture maturity assessment and you look at that and the improvements that come from that. And that is why it is important for the board to be aware of risk culture, and also not just about risk culture, but the maturity levels of risk culture. Two questions for those out there. Do you know where your business create or destroy value in its operations? And wasteful expenditure is an example of destroying value. Do you know that? And the other one, which is always the trigger a lot of discussion, is does your risk management process motivate or irritate your staff? Very often we find that it is irritating your staff because they're just giving a lot of information, they're doing a lot of reports, and these reports just go to the top. Now, when a risk report just goes to the top, it goes through what I call a process of sanctification. It gets better the higher it goes. And again, in an effective risk culture, that's not something that we want to see. So all organizations have got a culture, whether you like it or not, whether you believe it or not, there is a culture in your organization. So what is risk culture? I normally use the two definitions. There are a few others out there, but it mainly talks about the common understanding and the purpose. And if you look at the bottom one, again, the same things come out, the values and the beliefs for an understanding about risk and a group of people with a common purpose. And what is risk culture building? And this is something that I coined a few years ago because people ask me, what do you do? And I said, well, the main part of my job is to brainwash your people to think about risk differently and to take the right decisions to mitigate, control, or optimize risk to the advantage of the organization. So risk culture building is that training of the mind, the heart, and personal character of employees. And I'll touch a little bit on that later. We don't have time to go into all the details of this, but that is the key element. You want to change the hearts and the minds of employees. You want everybody to think about risk every day. And take note of the middle statement at the bottom there. You can't do today's job with yesterday's methods and still be in business tomorrow. It will just not work. So how do we look at organizational risk management culture? I will not override Warren Buffett's quote, but for me also, it's a direct reflection of the quality of the leadership. And this is why we want to start at the board of directors and make them aware of this, and also train them on how to look at the management of risk. Just a quick note on the paradigm shift. Traditionally, and what we see in most organizations today, are the things on the left-hand side. Risks are managed in silos that look at mostly at physical hazards and financial risks. Sometimes it's just, okay, we got to do a risk register and we got to transfer risk for insurance. And I think the thing that I already mentioned is getting everything green. It is not about getting everything green. We had a discussion yesterday with the members of Premier on the results of this global survey that we just completed at the end of last year. And a lot of that was also around, people just want to get everything green. And I used the quote that I also often use from the race driver Mario Andretti. And he said, if everything is under control, you're not going fast enough. So we need to come away from that mindset. We need to change that. And we need to look at what is emerging trends for the management of risk and the effective building of a risk culture in an organization. And you'll see the top thing there is driven by the board of directors. If we do an assessment and we present the results that go to the board of directors, and you have to have the buy-in of the board of directors. We want to make risk management continuous and embedded into the culture of the organization, and it's got to drive better decision making. As I said already earlier, it's about the right response to add value to the organization in the management of risk. Generally, it arises from the repeated behaviors of people. So you want to be consistent, and you want to look at how do we change the behaviors for the positive, and how do we continue and go forward and replicate those behaviors that we want. If we look at the levels of maturity, now when we originally designed the risk culture maturity monitor, which I will talk a little bit about at the end, we looked at 5 levels of maturity. And if you look at other information and other documents out there, generally people get to 5 levels of maturity, but they haven't done the descriptors in the way that we've done them here. So if we look at the very lowest level, in a bad risk culture, people just don't care. And then we go to a typical risk culture where they do things because there are policies and procedures and they care a little bit more. Then we get to a good risk culture where people do the right things, even if there aren't policies and procedures and controls in place. I've been in banking for more than 40 years, and I've never seen a bank where all the policies and procedures are up to date 100% at any point in time. So we always have situations where people need to think about the risk and they need to take decisions. In an effective risk culture, we're saying people care enough to think about it every day, and how do they make decisions, and they make and apply that to how they make decisions so that they make risk-informed decisions. And in the ultimate risk culture, the situation will be that every person acts as a risk manager and will constantly look at these risks. Very often we find that people just forget about risk management when they walk into the office. I often use the example of a risk evaluation on getting to the office on time, because everybody can relate to it and everybody knows that. But very often we find people just stop thinking about risk. They manage the traffic, they manage getting up on time, they manage getting to the office on time, And when they walk through the door and start doing their jobs, they forget about the management of risk. And we want to change that by building an effective risk culture. The capacity building, capability building block, this is the 6 areas of risk management that we look at when we do these assessments for the maturity. And I'll briefly just show you the capabilities at level 1. They're on the screen there. You're at level 1, the very lowest level, which I described, where people just don't care. There are very often no documented policies. There's no real substance in the management of risk. There are hardly ever any kind of limits. And we have the same for all 6 those areas. And then if we look at level 5, which is the ultimate level, if we just look at the example of policies again, there's enterprise-wide risk management strategies with clearly defined goals and objectives. Known to all the staff, available on the corporate intranet, that would be a plus. I've seen organizations where that's even available on an internal staff app, mobile app that they have on their phones. We're looking at and focusing on continuous improvement, and everybody who get into the organization is trained on risk management as they come into the organization. Now, I've just briefly looked at one example here. Like I mentioned, we have the same for all the others. I will be sending a handout of all 5 levels and the capabilities at the 5 levels, which Sharon can distribute to everybody who joined us on the webinar, so that you have all the materials for this. If we just look at the principles, I'm just going to highlight 2 or 3 of them. The key thing is down to towards the bottom on flexible and innovative. We must be able to respond and act very quickly. If we look at the second one from the top, and this is again triggered many debates at conferences, there must be a return on investment. I've often said, if the risk department does not add more value than what it costs to have them, there's no use having them. So they got to add value. If we just look at the approach we follow for building risk culture, it's generally the 4 pillars. Think differently is based on thinking like a risk manager, not just thinking generally, I got to do my job, I follow the policies and the procedures, and that's it. In each and every situation, think differently. I always use the example of a motor car accident, and then I ask people, what is the first thing you do when you are one of the people on the pavement? And the standard answer used to be phone the ambulance, phone the police. Lately, the standard answer is take a picture for Facebook. And then I ask them to think like a risk manager. Now, if you think like a risk manager, the very first thing you do is you put out the red triangles. You don't want a 2-car accident to become a 20-car accident. The second pillar we look at when we build risk culture is get the whole picture. Look beyond the obvious things. I've always related that also back to the car analogy, that you can have the greatest risk dashboard, you can have the greatest dashboard, you can have the greatest rear view mirrors of what happened at the end of the last quarter. If you don't look through the windscreen, you're going nowhere. So getting the whole picture is looking beyond the obvious things. Focus on the emerging risks. The risks that are not in your risk register are the most important ones. You got to look through the windscreen when you do this. Build a risk nervous system is the 3rd pillar that we use. That is about getting information from inside the business and outside the business to manage risk better. We had an example a few years ago at a conference where a social media lawyer said insurance companies are now using this. The guy put a picture on Facebook and he said, I crashed mom's car last night. Luckily, it was insured. The mother put on the claim form that she was driving because the son did not have a license. So the insurance company looked at Facebook and said, we ain't paying. And then the very last pillar is make every employee a risk manager. People who follow me and read my articles will know my view on the 3 lines of defense, which is probably the biggest lot of nonsense for managing risk. But the main reason why that failed is we never trained that first line any risk management skills. So we got to make every employee a risk manager. So just a few thoughts on going forward, moving from what I call process to purpose. When we build an effective risk culture, these things are some of the things that will definitely add value to your business. We must move away from these backward-looking results. We must do that and make that mind shift from risk management to the effective management of risk by everybody every day on their jobs. Nothing will stop us faster than people who believe that the way they work yesterday is the best way to work tomorrow. We have to change. We have to change the way we think about risk. We have to change the way we formulate our responses to risk. There's two options only: make progress or make excuses. The effective management of risk is in the behaviors. We talked about the behaviors earlier, both the behaviors we want to encourage and the behaviors we want to avoid. Very often we only look at the red one. The managers keep these black books, and when the time comes for looking at performance assessments, they pull out those black books and we only talk about the behaviors we want to avoid. We must also talk about the behaviors we want to encourage. What are the good things people are doing and how do we take that forward? So a few final things. The risk profile of any organization must steadily increase. So if you have that traffic light thing that we talked about in the beginning, as you get better at the management of risk, you want to take more risk for more reward. So you would probably want to see more amber and red stuff. I always relate that back again to the car analogies to the speed limit. If the speed limit is 120 and you're going down to the coast, you're not going to drive at 60 kilometers per hour where everything is green. You're going to drive at 119 kilometers per hour. So if everything is green, back to Mario Andretti's quote, if everything is under control, you're not going fast enough. So we need to think about that, and we need to apply that to the way that we look at the management of risk, because very often it is just about getting everything green. And if your objective is only to mitigate risk, then you will go out of business because you're not taking enough risk. We look at the assessments, and what we've done with Genius Methods is we've developed an online tool to actually measure these maturities. And the reason for that was when I was a consultant those years when we developed this, I got two questions when I went to any organization. The one is, where are we? And the second one is, what do we need to do? And then you, as a consultant, spend weeks talking to everybody, doing questionnaires, doing 1 to 5 ratings and all kinds of things. And you come back to the executives, and what they say is, oh, that's your perception of our business. That's not the way it is here. So what we've done is we've developed a maturity assessment that is online. Everybody get a user ID and a password, and the people answer questions. They cannot manipulate those answers. They cannot manipulate the results because they don't know the maths behind it. And all the possible multiple choice answers are scrambled, so they cannot pick a pattern and try and manipulate the thing. So it's still a subjective assessment, but it's a lot more accurate than what we normally find when we, as consultants, do these questionnaires and rate yourself from 1 to 5. Here are the key things we look at, as I've mentioned before: policies, reporting, processes, systems and data, management and control, people and organizational design. So you are welcome to contact us for this. And I'm open to questions later on after the conversation, but there is the website, and there's also my email address at Genius Methods. I had fun sharing this with you, and back to you, Sharon.
I'm on mute now. Sorry, my apologies. If I'd been on camera on a few occasions on that, you would have seen me smiling at the complexity of some of the issues that you were raising, and also the human behavior elements and the way people respond to the risk environment. I did have the odd smile, very much so. That was, I think people in our kind of environment really do get to see how these things manifest at a human level, and therefore how we actually create a lot of risk in the same aspect. Now, one thing you said was, I did like your car analogies as well. You were talking about the importance of the tone from the top, in my translated words, that we have to start at the top. And if we don't start at the board, and that comes with the chairman, and we've seen how chairmen can influence boards and their behavior in all elements, including risk. So the analogy of being in control means you're not taking enough risk, I thought was a very, very good analogy, because I think that one resonates with most of us as human beings. So thank you, Horst. We'll be back in a moment. Susie, would you like to join us? Susie, are you on camera?
Put me off, Sharon, I think.
Oh, do I have to get you back?
You have to put me on.
Here we go.
There
Sorry,
you go.
my sincere apologies on that.
No worries.
Thanks, Susie. I'm sure, as I saw you smiling at the beginning, I'm sure you did a few, like me, moments of, I've seen that before.
Lots of things we can all relate to there, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just a very high level question, just to get us going, because you see boards all the time. You see some of their challenges all the time. Is if you had to say, what are the most likely areas that you have seen where boards are falling short on this tone from the top, owning it, but also not killing the business at the same time?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of things that you said in your introduction, as well as Horst was saying there in his presentation about risk culture, that we can all relate to. When you speak to risk professionals, they understand how it works. They understand the benefit and the value that it adds. When you often speak with boards will still look at it as a compliance aspect, as a thing that will slow the business down, as another set of documents I need to fill out. And the cost, yeah, there was a point where Horst there was talking about people often ask, where are we and what do we need to do? And there's one more question that goes with that, and it's how much is it going to cost? And that's the one I get all the time, right? What do we need to do and how much budget do you need? Mm-hmm. Not my budget, it's your budget, you do it. So it's the ownership piece for the board is very different depending on the organization. Again, you touched on this in the introduction. In the financial services world, through regulation, there's been a lot more structure, a lot more robust structure, methodology and approach applied to risk management. And you tend to find that the boards in financial services and the management in financial services understand the need for it a lot better. There's still a lot of improvements that can be made, and we're seeing a lot of that come out from recent reform. But still in the financial services world, there's a different approach. In other businesses that I've worked with that are not so directly regulated, the approach to risk management can be viewed as being negative, as you said, can be as slowing the business down, not creating innovation and opportunity, not looking at entrepreneurialism. And actually, the way that we approach risk management in those types of boards and organizations is to put it back to the strategy. What is it you're trying to achieve? What are your objectives? And what are the things that are going to stop you achieving those things? And not looking at risk from a set of risk registers or a set of dashboards or a set of traffic lights, as Horst was talking about there, which will switch people off, right? But talking about risk much more in the language that they understand, talking about risk around the opportunities that they're looking to take, around the growth of the business, or whatever the objectives are, whether it's growth or it's new markets, whether it's new products, whether it's acquisitions, whatever it is. What are the things that are going to slow it down? What are the things that are going to get in the way? And that is risk management. If we strip away the language and we strip away a lot of the methodology that a lot of us are very comfortable with, a lot of us risk professionals are very comfortable with, you start to speak the language of the board, you start to speak the language of the entrepreneurial leadership, of the strategist, and you can approach risk from a very different way. At the end of the day, risk taking should be informed. Take whatever risk you want to take, so long as it's an informed decision. What's the information that you're going to need to make that decision? It might be tangible, it might be quantifiable information, it might be metrics and dashboards, it might be data that's going to help you drive that decision. It might be looking at what's happening in the external environment. What are the factors that are going to influence that decision that you haven't yet seen? What's the emerging risks that are coming up there? And it might also be looking at the impact that that decision is going to have on your wider stakeholder group. So again, when we sit in many boards, we often look at decisions around what's the impact to the business, what's particularly the financials, right? What's the financial impact to the business? What's the impact to us? Very inward looking. If we start to break that apart and say, okay, what's the impact of this decision on our multiple stakeholder groups? And we can all go through that list, right? What's the impact this is going to have on those multiple stakeholder groups? We start to build a much more informed picture and a much more long-term picture of what impact that decision will have. And that's where I talk about making informed decisions. Make decisions that are going to create risk. Make decisions that are going to drive the business forward. Make decisions that are going to be risky, but do it in a way that is an informed decision that you can hold your hat on and say, yes, we considered that. We thought about that.
And in your response to your informed decision, I would add the next moment. The next moment is I've taken a decision. Great. Now we move forward. With the right lens on, was that the right decision? So at all times, the board should be assessing, is there another decision that needs to be made? Because you're not going to get every single decision right. It's impossible, because the environment will change. So as the environment is changing, I see the next most critical thing is reassess. Do we need another decision? And then you get into human behavioral science of bias and all that thing, and then you watch it go wrong further.
Exactly. Continue to monitor that decision you've made, and you might need to flex along that road. You might need to make different decisions along the way. And I also think that's where the relationship between the risk management and the company secretary is really important, because the company secretary can help to build that structure around your board meetings and your board decisions and ensure that those considerations are coming back to the board at a later date. Which is
a very, very valid point. And thank you for making that one, because I think it is critical. If you were to be teaching some risk students that are about to go into the real world and they've not been there before, they've been in a wonderful university environment, and they haven't seen the real world, and they're now going to go out into it. Not specifically any industry, but what do you think should be those risks that the board are considering, that I think even yourself and myself and Horst have all said, the risks that are probably not on the risk register? What should be those that boards are today mindful of?
That's a really good question. And I think as many, may sound arrogant, many risk professionals, I could go in and write your risk register. I know what's going to be on it, right? Yeah. They've all got some very similar things on it. I could write your risk register for you and very much will walk away from that, job done, tick the box. But I like to look at it I like to look at it the other way around. Often when I see headlines and I see corporate disasters or catastrophes or huge mistakes that have been made, or particularly people that have been thrown up under the bus during that process, I always like to think about, what did the board know? When did they discuss this? And how much information did they really have? And was that an informed decision, or was that smoke and mirrors? Did they really know that this was going to have such a catastrophic impact to their business? And sometimes when we look at those headlines, it's the very small things, it's the little things that you may not have thought about that actually can have that big snowball effect and can be catastrophic to your business. So what are those little things that you may be laughed at for suggesting, right? And you do have to grow thick skin, I'm afraid, in this job. But you may be laughed at for suggesting that this may have a longer term impact, or this may have an impact. It might be a reputational impact rather than a financial impact, or directly financial impact. But thinking about those things, and that's the skill set that a risk professional brings, is they think about things in a different way. You know, Horst touched on it earlier around having that holistic view, having the wider view around what might happen, not what's necessarily directly in front of you or what it is that you're looking at today, but what are the things, the impacts that that could have. It's a difficult one for a risk professional because they are often seen as the naysayer. They're often seen as the negative person that comes along with the what ifs, and what about that, and the catastrophizing. But actually, if it's done right, it's about getting other people to think in that way. So getting other people to think about the what if a little bit more, and just consider that, and whether that's something that needs to be explored further.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's taken a long time to get onto people's risk register or onto the board agenda, high enough up the priority list, has been this whole ESG, diversity, equity, and inclusion, to the point that actually it's got to the stage now where it's actually almost boring, because everybody's talking about it now. So now it's at its most dangerous level, because we've got to a stage where those things we must talk about, okay, all right, they must be on the agenda, but they're not actually really engaging properly, mindfully in this process. So one of my concern is that we do still see a lot of tick boxing, saying, nodding yes, but doing something different. We do still see a fair amount of that. But just to go to another conversation, when I work with boards, you come across your different thinking styles of the individuals present. And you get people that are more vertically, professionally trained, and you've got those that are salespeople, marketing, creative, color, your left brain, right brain kind of people to a certain degree. And the concern that I have, and you talked about you could write the report before you, or the register before you even go into the company. One of the things I can do is invariably write the board evaluation report after I've spoken to the company secretary. Why do I need to spend all the time speaking to another 15 people? But the thing that I notice is, because of the different thinking styles, you get a different perspective on things. Brilliant. That's what diversity is all about. But you also do get the inability by certain people, certain professions, certain roles, certain age groups, certain diversity categorization, where they just can't do this. They can't do blue skies. They can't stand up on the bridge of the ship and look and see if they can see something. If I can't see it, how can I imagine it's there? You know, this unknown really does destabilize a lot of people if that conversation is being had. And they can completely thwart the conversation by saying, you can't have this conversation because it's not here yet, kind of thing. How do you feel the risk competent people in a boardroom should support those that find blue skies thinking, whether it be strategy, risk management, any of these things, where I'm thinking not on my spreadsheet, I'm thinking out there? How would we help them?
That's interesting. There are, I would say, one of the skills of a good risk professional is emotional intelligence, and being able to read a room and being able to deal with different people in very different ways, and understanding those that are much more methodical, and those that will understand and interpret data in a better way, and those that are perhaps a bit more creative, that you need to speak to use a different language and use in a different way. I think often it depends on where the organization is in its level of maturity, and I say that from its level of perhaps strategic planning maturity. So how far down the line are they actually thinking? Is this an organization that is thinking really short term and is perhaps looking at a 1 year time frame, perhaps in its business planning or its financial planning, and it's not ready to quite lift its head up beyond that viewpoint at the moment? Then actually taking that in a much more gentle way to look at actually what are the things we need to look at for this year, and perhaps consider as on a longer term. And then others, and I've seen it through organisations that have then matured into 3-year business planning, and that gives us a much greater opportunity to think about the things in a longer time frame, longer time scale. We've got regulation. We have Section 172, which requires us to think about long-term business planning. Right, we can write it down on the paper. Doesn't necessarily people think that interpret into the way that people are actually going to be thinking about their business plans. So we help them think about the things that are going to impact that particular decision or that particular strategic objective in a longer term view. And I think this is where, back to your ESG point, I think this is where many organizations really struggle with ESG, or particularly with the environmental and climate aspects of ESG, because it's asking us to look at 2050. It's asking us to start planning now.
And a roadmap to it.
And create a roadmap for the next 25 years. For an organisation that struggles to look beyond 1 year, that's incomprehensible to think about what we need to think about. So again, breaking it down into its bite-sized chunks. Let's not think about what we want the end result for 2050 to be. Let's think about what do we need to do this year to start creating a plan for 2050. That's enough. Stop there. That's enough. That's all we have to do. And you start to make those things not so scary, not so unachievable. And the risk of that is you push them down the line. Oh, it's 2050. We'll think about it next year. We'll think about it in 5 years' time. We'll think about it. What is it that we actually just need to do this year or over the next 3 years, and break it down into those bite-sized chunks that are far more manageable for some people.
Yeah, definitely the emotional ability to embrace it gets easier. And sometimes it's all about decision making. If you try and ask people to make too big a decision, they become rabbits in a headlight. But the first decision is, can we look at it? Okay, well, we've got past that one. So you get to the ultimate decision, which then is only a small decision at the end.
Yeah.
So if your whole decision-making cycle. One of the customers I've worked with had the flock of black swans that flew over, and they make a mess. Logistics, weather, crop, ports, load shedding, electricity, logistical issues, global pandemic, ships in the wrong part of the world, your whole tariff situation, Brexit, and can I go on? One company. And then just to add to all of it, they had a massive computer hack, and they were out for months. So when this happens and it's a mess, what's the role of the risk professional? What is the role of the board to support throughout the organization where risk is now being done? The activity stuff is happening. How do this top of the pyramid help the company?
And that's, I can think of some examples where I've often heard it said that risk management done well, nothing happens. There's no issues, there's no errors. But I've also seen where risk management comes into its own is where there is a crisis, or where there is an issue that particularly needs to be, particularly where it's something that was outside of our control. Right? We've all seen this with COVID, we've seen it with Russia, we've seen it with Brexit, etc. So where there's something outside of control, how do we manage those events, and how do we learn from them, and how do we then build that thinking in, so that we don't have a crystal ball and we're not going to know what big event is going to land next that's outside of our control. But we can be prepared for an event. We can be prepared for, as I say, if it's something that's going to have an operational impact. COVID was a great example, right? Do we have the ability to work remotely? Those are all things we've learned to do. If it's going to have a big financial impact on the business, if it's an event that's going to have a financial impact, do we have sufficient reserves? Do we have sufficient contingency to be able to, for resilience for the business to be able to continue over a longer term? So we're not necessarily going to, no risk professional is ever going to be able to identify future events that are unknown. But how can we plan for them? How can we prepare for them? How can we put some stress testing in now, perhaps some scenario testing in now, just to see if that type of event were to occur, what would we do? And just be a little bit more prepared for when things do happen. We're not panicking. We know how to respond. We know how to deal with it. And we can prioritize as well how much focus and effort we need to put into this area in order to keep our business going and surviving.
No, thank you. In other words, we are developing a culture and a situation within our business environment of being able to respond rather than react.
Yes,
which is a much safer,
resilience.
We're seeing resilience.
Yes, we're seeing resilience coming out now in the new UK corporate governance reform. Talks a lot about resilience planning and documenting resilience planning. How do businesses really understand where that comes from?
Because financial services knows stress testing well. Horst, would you like to join us so we can have some open question time? And one of the questions I would like to just take from the floor, which is around how do we educate our regulators in financial services? And I'm sure this is a global issue, not just a local UK issue. How do we actually help the regulator understand that a risk register, risk tolerances are all sitting in green, green, and green, above, below, and in the middle, and therefore they can tick the box, the green box. How do we educate our regulators to think differently? First of all, they've got to listen to your PowerPoint. After that,
yeah, I think I was also having a few laughs whilst you two were talking, and I'm very glad you've gone to the resilience side and not talked about business continuity, because everybody talks about business continuity and test your plans and then you're ready. No, you're not ready, because I've never seen any disaster follow anybody's plan. So you're never ready for that. It is about how well you train your people to respond to a situation of risk when it arises. So just stop spending money on those plans. Spend money on training people, risk management skills. I saw the question also around the regulators, and honestly, most regulators are still stuck in the past. The way I look at it and the way that I talk to our clients about it and the people that I interact with is yes, they are in the past. At best, you can try and influence them and educate them on this kind of thinking of risk culture and around, going forward with how do we effectively manage risk, because it's not just 3 lines of defense. ISO 31000 with all its steps is also out of date, because all it does is just in the end give you a risk report, which is as at the end of last quarter. So I would say that's a key thing, but don't be focused on just what the regulator wants. It's back to the point I made earlier of risk must add value. Regulatory, and if they want the 3 lines of defense and pink, yellow, orange reports, that's fine. Give it to them, but you shouldn't be constrained by that. You should be driving, adding value through the management of risk, and they'll catch up. But yeah, looking at what the regulators want should be seen as a compliance matter, but that should not be the focus and the existence of the risk department. They should be there to add value and drive business.
Understand that, because it is, as you say, looking through the rearview mirror. Susie, anything you want to add to that, because you come from a regulated space?
Yeah, I mean, I would add a couple of things. One is we need to learn, take forward the good practice that we see from regulation, right? What regulation does bring is it brings some good methodology and good practice that can actually be incorporated in the non-regulated, if you like, world. And I think we need to take some of those principles forward, because if they work, they work. They'll work in any environment, and we shouldn't be segregating between what we have to do in a regulated environment and what we have to do in a non-regulated environment. So I think there's things that business can learn from the regulation that's been introduced. I also think from the regulator's standpoint, I have yet to see regulatory enforcement where the letter of the law wasn't followed, but actually the outcome was good, right? So ultimately focusing on good outcomes, having the right principles, and ensuring that that the risks are managed and identified, the regulator isn't going to come down with you on, come down on you on that because you haven't ticked a particular box or because you haven't followed section 17. You've done something completely different. So I think sometimes we get too hung up on the detail of the regulation rather than actually what it's trying to do and the principles that it's trying to apply. And it's ultimately written for a few bad eggs, right? It's written for the minority. It's written for a small number of areas that are going to suffer and are going to fail. For everybody else, take the principles, take the messaging, take some of the good practice that it's introducing and make it work for you.
Excellent advice, and I hope everybody was listening. We are getting towards our close. Horst, would you like to give us just some final thoughts that you would like to share if you were chatting to a chairman post a review?
Great, thank you, Sharon. Yeah, I think just one thing before I give some ideas around that quickly is there was another question of how do you handle the board when they think that we're stuck on the colors and that. And I've often walked in and they have those discussions, and my question is just, do you care how much petrol was in your car last week? And generally the answer is no. And when they answer no, my next question is, so why do you run your business like that? And then the lights go on. So I think the key thing here is be aware of unconscious biases. Obviously, is one thing we need to think about when we do these things. And the rest is the conversations are more important than the risk reports. And I've often said that in many forums. The conversations you have about risk and emerging risks, they are more important than the risk report. Yes, you need the risk report, but it contributes a very small portion to your risk intelligence. Being effective at the management of risk is looking through that windscreen and talking about what could happen, what will happen. And the important thing that I've learned lately is there's not one future. There are multiple versions of the future. So don't think there's one future and one 5-year strategy. If you're stuck there, you're going to be out of business.
Thank you, Horst. Susie, your advice to a chairman as a
I
closing
would
comment?
say, don't be frightened of it. Don't be frightened of risk management. It doesn't have to be boring. It doesn't have to be slowing your business down. It doesn't have to be adding bureaucracy. Don't be frightened of it. This is something that's here to enable you to be creative and to enable you to drive your business forward. Embrace it.
I think the message that I really appreciate from what you both said is it's not about a process. It's not about compliance. It's about the future. And some people do struggle to look into the future. That's not a comfortable place for them at all. But let's work with the team members that can look into the future and draw on that cohort strength from within the board and the executive to actually get that risk awareness, up our risk appetite, up our mitigation strategies, so that when things do start to go wrong, that we have got an ability to put that red line in the sand and say, okay, that's enough now. We now have to make a difficult decision. And I was listening to somebody talking yesterday saying sometimes the decisions you have to make you don't like, but that's okay, you still have to make them. So thank you very much. We are perfectly on time. I've still got pages of things I'd love to have discussed. So I think there might be another replay of some of these issues around risk in the future, because it is a very big topic. And today it's very, very critical. And we are being hit by geopolitical issues, by political issues, by business issues, by economic issues, interest rate strategies, all these trade wars. There are so many things that are impacting us at a global level that our boards need to look at, because they do affect you. Even if it's not you directly, you'll get it indirectly. So look out for the indirect risk that it might come your way as well. So thank you very much, Susie. You've been fantastic and very insightful. Horst, you've been very, very helpful in bringing some analogies that make it quite logical to actually understand and to accept that we need to change our mindset somewhere along the line. So I'm going to go and make sure I've got petrol in my tank for the next journey.
Thank you. And it's really like Susie said, risk shouldn't be boring, and let's make it fun, and let's do it, do the best for the organization.
Thank you very, very much. Appreciate it, both of you, and look forward to seeing you both again in person, which I will be doing at some point in time.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.